All right, so after serial endosymbiosis occurs and we start to get eukaryotic cells, the eukaryotic cells diversify into all different types of eukaryotic cells. So we have this kingdom of life in the eukaryotes called the Protista. The Protista are often left out of most courses. So, of course, an animal biology doesn't cover them, plant biology doesn't cover them. General microbiology classes sometimes cover a few of the organisms in the group that cause disease, but many times don't and focus more on bacteria and prokaryotes. Mycology courses and fungi typically don't cover them. They're often left out. General biology courses sometimes will skip them, partly because there's so much content in the course, and this is a particularly tricky group to really talk about. So following that, we're not going to spend a ton of time really covering them, but we are going to talk a little bit about the protists. Who are they? What are some of the characteristics they have? What's some of the diversity within the group? And then particularly how that's going to lead us to the plants, because that's kind of what we're moving through with this particular lecture. So that's going to kind of be the point of kind of drawing us through it, is going to be looking at that focus. But in addition to it, we're going to look at some other things as well about protists. So first off, why is this a group that's often avoided or not covered? Right? Is it just small or insignificant? No, it's an incredibly large group with an enormous number of phyla, probably about 30 plus to it could be as many as 50 phyla. But that's because people don't really agree upon the way that much of the group is classified. There's often reclassification. There are groups that are collapsed. There are groups that are split. You can look at a lot of different places and find different numbers of groups and subgroups and so forth. This group, in addition to that, is a polyphyletic group. All right, so what does that mean? It means that normally when we look at cladistics, right, and we look at how organisms are classified, if organisms A, B, and C are being looked at, organisms A, B, and C have to share a whole list of common characteristics with one another, and that those characteristics have to be related to some common ancestor. That makes, and then there should be no other members of the group. So there's not like, so if organism D doesn't share this common ancestor, doesn't share some of these traits, it might belong to a different group or a different lineage, the idea. Here, the idea is we have groups that sort of follow different branches, different lineages. So this is an ancestor over here. And then we're kind of saying, these are all one group, Protist. But there's a different ancestor over here and a different ancestor over here. So aren't they different groups? And so that's why it's called poly or many phyletic. There are many different ancestors for members of the group. They're not as closely related as they should be to be in this classification system. So it's one of the things that leads to reclassification and a lot of problems, right, with them. So without going into all that kind of detail, which is usually skipped over even in really advanced courses, I'm just going to mention it because it's for a non-majors class. So protists, what are they? So mostly single-celled organisms. Single-celled eukaryotic organisms. So organisms with a nucleus that are single cells, as opposed to the bacteria, which are single-celled organisms, but they don't have a nucleus. They're prokaryotic, right? So these are eukaryotic organisms. So, but how are they then classified? How do we look at them? What kinds of diversity do you see within them? Well, you see an enormous amount of diversity. So, but they're going to be always eukaryotic, have the nucleus, have that. Generally single-celled, but not always. Some are multicellular. So some are colonial. And then some say multicellular. So true multicellular. So I'll talk about that in a second. So colonial is where we have sort of a group of cells, but they're all the same type of cell, and they're all together. So it's essentially just like a single cell. That's a single cell. That's a single cell. That's a single cell. But instead of just existing as a single cell, the cells kind of divide, but instead of separating, they stay stuck together and form a colony. So instead of separating the last part after mitosis, where you get then cytokinesis and the cells split apart into different cells, and then the cells can either stay stuck together or split. In this particular case, they stay stuck together. And so you form this sort of colony. And you find some groups of protists that only exist in these colonies of cells, not just as an individual cell. There aren't different types of cells. So that's kind of what we get in multicellularity. In multicellularity, we see differentiation. So we see one organism, say like us, okay, for example, we are made up of cells, but we have skin cells, okay? Some of those cells secrete different proteins that create structures, right? Like our nails, right? And hair, right? Beneath that, there are different layers of skin cells that are of different structure. You have then muscle cells, different than your skin cells. Connective tissue cells, different than them. Cells in your vascular system, cells structuring the walls of your blood vessels, cells within the blood vessels, the red blood cells and white blood cells and all different types of cells. So there's all these cells in one organism, so they differentiated and became slightly different than one another. Okay, so that's what we have in multicellular organisms, many cells, and the cells are different from one another. They have the same origin. There was a fertilization event where there was a single cell that divided and then became different kinds of cells. And so we have things called macroalgae. Kelp, for example. A kelp can be, 30 meters in length, so almost like 100 feet, typically not that long, but they can be, because they can get up to the surface and then grow along the surface of the water and then become very, very long. And so they're enormous, but they're a protist, technically. They belong to this particular group. So they're a very large multicellular organism with some diversity within them. So they're sort of like a hold fast at the bottom. It's not a root structure, but just kind of holds them in place. There's no transport or anything like that. They have fronds, kind of like leaves, but not. They're different. They're sort of area for photosynthesis, and they have little floats within them. They're full of gases and air to kind of allow them to grow upwards. They don't have a structural inner structure to stabilize them. So when they hit land or air, they just kind of collapse. And that's kind of one of the things we're going to get to with plants. Okay, so as protists eventually give rise to plants, we will have some type of algae, not the kelp, but we'll have some other type of algae ancestor, right, who is a multicellular protist who does photosynthesis and starts to get up to the surface, and then has trouble because the air dries them out, because gravity kind of pulls them down. Normally they could be floating, in the water, and now they're just kind of flattened onto the ground, and they can't really grow upward because they don't have inner structures to do that. There's a bunch of challenges then to living on land that they would then face, and that's going to be some of the adaptations to the land plants that we get coming from multicellular protist ancestors, which is kind of where we're going to end this lecture, and that's kind of where we're going. Before we get there, talking a little bit more about, so how do we classify protists? So to stick with the protists and talk about them before we move on. There are modern ways of doing it, and there are traditional ways. Many times what we find is as they kind of keep being reorganized and reorganized and reorganized, and different people, most people just kind of avoid them, but when people do focus on them, they come up with some different way of looking at them. Traditional ways. So traditionally, locomotion, how they move, was one of the main characteristic features. Okay, and so that would either be through cilia, flagella, my little red pink one's dying, I'll have to make a new one, amoeboid. And I'll talk about them over here. So cilia, flagella, or amoeboid motion. Those are three of the main ways of moving around. So flagella, obviously a single long structure extending from the cell of the organism that moves and allows them to then move or swim through the water. Cilia, so this would be flagella. Cilia are made up of the exact same proteins in the exact same structural arrangement as flagella. They're exactly the same. If you were to slice them, look at them under the microscope, one little cilia, one flagella, they look identical to one another. The difference is the length. Flagella are long, cilia are short. And typically the organisms who have cilia have many of them covering the entire surface of the cell, whereas the organisms that have flagella generally only have one, they may have two, they usually have a few of them. They do not typically cover the entire cell. They may just be at one end, or maybe at both ends, or maybe a small tuft of them. But that's all we typically see. The cilia cover the entire cell. Amoeba have no extensions like this from the cell, but they have the same kind of material inside the cell that is then pushing on the cell membrane, and it causes the cell membrane to kind of stretch outward and form what's called a pseudopod. And then that membrane might stick to a surface and then actually reshape the cell. The cell pulls itself kind of like into a little ball, and then it might extend out again, like blebbing. The cells are kind of like changing shape, and then they sensing the environment and then moving in particular directions, so kind of crawling around. What we found is that when looking at molecular relationships between the organisms, many times it still keeps coming back to these kind of organizations where the ciliates are like a group, and there's maybe two different groups of flagellates and so forth. Amoebas are divided up into a whole bunch of different groups as well. Some of them that have shells, right, or things called a theca. So inside this little prism-like structure here is actually a cell, right? So there's a living cell with a nucleus in there, a single cell. But then they either secrete material that hardens around the shell, around the cell, that's like a little shell, okay? And that could be made up of a variety of different kinds of materials. So sometimes the material itself, like what is it that makes up the theca, that's used in classification. So silicon dioxide or calcium carbonate or other types of materials, and then they might go into different groups. Some of these can actually be very large. So I've held one in my hand, almost like the size of a smaller, but the size of like a marble. It's one cell, right? But it has a little shell around it, this theca. And the one that I had worked with actually secretes a glue and actually glues sand grains together. So actually the live cell is covered in sand that has been glued together to kind of form this structure. Right? And these are all just single-celled organisms. Like I said, some of them can be very large, right, in terms of their structure, and some of them can be very small. So you have single-celled organisms, mostly in the Protist, all eukaryotes. They may move around in different ways using cilia or flagella or amoeboid motion. They may have little coverings around them or not, or no covering whatsoever. If they do, that covering could be made up of different kinds of material. They may be colonial in that they live in groups of cells, all the exact same kind of cell, not differentiated, but they live in a group of cells. And then they could be multicellular. So how do they feed? That's another way sometimes that the protists are classified, right? So some of them are heterotrophic, and some of them are autotrophic. Again, this is kind of pulling us to the point of this lecture is to kind of get to autotrophic plants, photosynthesis, kind of moving in that direction, talking about protists in general, and then kind of pulling us in one particular focal point. So heterotrophs mean they get their nutrients from outside sources. So phagocytosis, so you have cells that may eat other cells. Okay, so this cell here is this cell opened up, part of it kind of engulfed, right? This cell here, pulled it into it, and then inside this cell, lysosomes and structures could attach, release enzymes here to digest and break up and destroy the cell, getting all the sugars, amino acids, lipids, all the phospholipids, all the things that made up that cell now can be taken into and digested by and then reused by this particular cell. So this cell simply eats other cells and then digests them, right? So as a heterotroph. Others are autotrophic, right? Meaning they run photosynthesis, which I'll talk about the details of separately here. But the autotrophs usually here are referred to as algae. And so we have microalgae and macroalgae. Okay. So microalgae are the single-celled ones. The macroalgae are the multicellular. So that's one way of breaking down the algae, right, by the single-celled algae or the multicellular algae. The other way of breaking down the algae, right, into different groups are by the main pigments. So there's the reds, the browns, the greens. Because of this coloration, there are ones called goldens, which are a little bit different as well. So we have different groups of algae based on pigmentation. Okay? And these could be single-celled red algae, single-celled brown algae, single-celled green algae, and they can be multicellular. So we have macroalgae that are green algae. Right? So there's a lot of both freshwater and marine algae that are like this, reds and browns, all right, as well. So they're just collecting light from a variety of different wavelengths, but still performing the same photosynthetic process. And then they might display one color much more so than another color, right, in their patterns. As we look at the history of plants, we kind of come back to, where they came from. So at some point in time, all living things are in the Earth's oceans. Cells, single-celled organisms. So then the cells start to become multicellular organisms. They're living in the ocean. So we get the protists will have ancestors that give rise to plants. The protists will have ancestors that give rise to animals. The protists will have ancestors that give rise to the fungi, right? All from different types of protists. But the protists would be ancestors in some way, not the same one, but different protists to all the different groups from the other kingdoms. Where do plants then come from? Well, so multicellular, right, and green, right? So it's a multicellular green algae who would be the ancestor to land plants. So there's a variety of different multicellular green algae, and there's a particular group called the charophyceans. The charophyceans are a group that exists today. They're these freshwater algae that are multicellular, and they start to display some characteristics that are shared with land plants, including a specific chemical called sporopollenin. And I'll actually go over this again in the next little talk as we start to talk about plant adaptation to land, and then the diversity of plants, which will be kind of the next lecture that we'll do. So this is what's going to happen is they're going to be in shallow waters. The water evaporates. The plants can't survive. They die. There's diversity, genetic diversity within these algae. Okay, sorry. That some of them can survive in the air. Maybe they have thicker layers or a new type of coating that's unique, right? Maybe in the water it doesn't really help them. Maybe in the water it even hurts them in some way. But when exposed to air, it traps moisture inside them, and so they can survive when exposed to air for maybe brief periods of time. Again, selection occurs over time. Organisms who can survive in the air, maybe then they can reproduce and have more like them that can also survive in the air. Those organisms then eventually give rise to a group now that can get way more light. So that's one of the advantages of why, the question, why would you leave the water then? Why go through this challenge and change? Because there's competition, right? In the water for space, there's competition in the water for light. And so as the organisms try to come up to shallower waters where there's more light, again, there's more and more competition. So some of them are going to be exposed to air, and the air will harm them or stress them, and most of them won't be able to survive in that environment. But some that can then could adapt to inhabit this environment where there are no plants, there are no algae, there's nothing doing photosynthesis up on land. So now these organisms have everything, every land surface to potentially colonize. So moving up out of the water onto land is a whole new environment with all different types of resources to exploit, but also challenges of living exposed to the air, gravity now pulling down on them, and they can't adapt to that yet. But over time, some of them will have variations that will help them in those environments. So that's kind of what we're going. So final thing on protists. Protists are one of our eukaryotic kingdoms. Okay, so they're a kingdom of life made up of mostly single-celled organisms. It is a polyphyletic group, meaning we don't have a really good hold on common ancestors for all of them. Different types of protists have different distant ancestors, right? So it's a difficult group to classify. How do you study the protists, or how will we study the protists, at least in this class? Just a little bit, and mostly just identifying, how do they move? They move with either cilia or flagella or amoeboid motion, generally. Those are the main ways. And that used to be one of the main classification mechanisms as well. Are they all single-celled? No, some of them can be in different forms, and so we have the multi and colonial forms as well. Are they all algae, all photosynthesis? No, some of them eat, other cells. They're heterotrophic, right? And some of them do photosynthesis. The ones who do photosynthesis also have variation within them with different types of pigments, and they get classified that way as well. So the protists are an enormous group of organisms that do a variety of different things, and these are just some of the different characteristics of those groups. But what we're focusing on are the group of protists who are multicellular green algae who are now going to give rise to land plants. And that's where we go next.